Thank you, sir. So what I wanted to do is, this question probably everyone feels like, why am I even saying, trying to answer this question, why hydrogen fuel cell makes sense. What I'm aiming to do with this presentation is actually to provide a perspective, and a perspective that looks at a little bit of history, looks at the current situation, and a little bit of where this is going to lead to. So if we can, thank you. So, and this is the only slide I'll talk about my company. Work for a company called RaCanaa Energy, and we are an energy management company. So most of you might ask, why am I talking about fuel cells and for mobility? That's purely because I'd spent about 30 years working on hydrogen fuel cells and building vehicles running on different technologies, including battery technology. So that's the only thing I'll put in here, but let's jump to the topic. So let's go a little bit into the history. So in the late 19th century, we were running, transportation was by horses. And at that time, we had this interesting quote by the person who came up with the steam engine, who said that horses are self-feeding, self-controlling, self-maintaining, and self-reproducing. And for more economical, and much more economical in the energy than any other motor. So I won't read the exact quote. But that's what we were dealing with. But then there was a problem, that these horses, as they increased in number, they were polluting these streets, and they wanted to look for a solution to that. So that was the first transition, where you looked at a transition from an existing powertrain to something different. And that's when you came up with this transition to a new prime mover. So at that point of time, you had competition between steam cars, electric cars, and your internal combustion engine cars. Even hybrid vehicles were there. But then, there was a time actually electric cars were leading the race, but then with the invention of the electric starter, and then with the Ford Model T, and then the discovery of crude oil or petroleum in Texas, all that changed, and the internal combustion engine actually won the race. So now, we're back at the next transition. And here, I'll start talking about from a very Indian perspective. So what's our current challenge? Is sustainability. People have talked about different aspects of it. For me, sustainability is three things from an energy standpoint. It's energy security, the environment, and economics. You have to be able to balance those three to make that work. So this is what I call the three E's. If not, you see the challenges. I'm not going to read them out. We are a country, and this is now going specifically to the Indian perspective. If you look at it, we are about 18% of the world's population. We have less than 1% of the world oil reserves, and 9.5% of the coal reserves. And about 90% of our primary energy comes from these fuels. So there is no energy security. There is no environment. Economics, well, we can talk about that, right? So we need a solution, a long-term solution that is not dependent on petroleum or fossil-based systems. So what is that? So let's look at what India can do and where India is capable of trying to reach what we call sustainability. So there are two sources of energy, and one I think Dr. Sonde had referred to earlier today is nuclear. Interestingly, India has one of the largest reserves of thorium. Thorium is not a fissile material, but it's what we call a fertile material, which through breeder reactors can be looked at. And there's enough thorium in India that I looked at it about 750 years, but there are lots of other literature where people are talking about thousands of years of energy capability from thorium. And obviously renewables. These are the two sources of fuel, at least from an energy security standpoint, are things that can help India sustain. And why am I talking about all this? Because this ultimately ties to why and what we are looking from a mobility standpoint for India. So this is another piece that everyone's talked about. So with these primary energy sources, which assure us energy security, we can look at two energy carriers, electricity and hydrogen, that can help us with the motive side of it. So that's the place we are at today. Today, like in the early 20th century, we are at a point where we are competing to a certain extent, but not also to a certain extent. But that's a perspective of the industry. Now, this is a few years back. This is not current, it's a few years back. Elon Musk had said fuel cell electric vehicles are mind-bogglingly stupid, and you had Toyota at that point saying battery electric cars are not practical. Now, I am not saying we have to take any of these perspectives, but we have to look at what's practical and right for India and move in that direction. So what is practical and right? So there is fuel cell electric vehicles today that are in production, and the price is not that much higher than what you would expect. So today, a fuel cell powered Toyota Mirai is available in California for about $50,000. And there's a higher version at about $66,000. And if you look at its performance, look at what it can do, it is just as good or better than any other vehicle out there. But then what's the challenge? The biggest challenge is the infrastructure, the ecosystem that you need to deliver fuel to these vehicles. So it's the same question everyone's asked. How do you get that? So right now, performance-wise, I'll just jump to this one. A lot of people have asked this question, what does it take for us to actually set up the infrastructure? And many people have opined in the earlier that, look, developing a whole hydrogen infrastructure could be extremely expensive. There was a study done, and this is a little old, by the European Union, where they compared what it takes to create for a full deployment, a hydrogen infrastructure versus electric infrastructure. And if you look at the numbers, it's about 101 billion euros at that time for a hydrogen infrastructure and about 550 billion euros for electric. I won't go into the details of it, but bottom line, what they looked at was a hydrogen infrastructure, because the speed at which you can refuel could be a one-to-many infrastructure, whereas an electric infrastructure is limited to a few. It's either a private infrastructure where you have, let's say, 15, 20, 30 minutes to do a fast charge, and there's a limited number of spots, or it's something in your own house where you're using that to charge. So those costs, though everyone believes that, okay, it's in my house, so it should be okay, but what you are finding, especially in India, especially with a lot of the urban cities, that the cost of actually putting that charger infrastructure into your apartment complexes or garages is not as simple or not as easy. So there are challenges with it. So for the first 5, 10, 15%, okay, I can work it, but once you go beyond that, then there's a need to have something much more substantial. So and I'll conclude here. If you look at it today, and if I were to opine today, I would say the best bet for us to go forward in the long term is with hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. And there are several reasons for it. Obviously, as the grid gets greener, our cost per kilometer of charging electric vehicles in terms of the carbon will come down. But today, it's among the highest in the world. For every kilometer, it's about close to 300 grams of carbon that we're emitting, even though we are running electric vehicles, because of the generation mix that we have today. And if you look at it, the costs are coming down. I think the professor has talked about it. So that's another piece. So if I were to opine today, I would look at giving hydrogen fuel cells the upper hand, and the fact that what we need to do to develop it further is the investment that's needed to get to the ability, have that ability to deploy the infrastructure so vehicles can run smoothly. When I say ecosystem, the ecosystem is not just the infrastructure, but it's also the standards, all the training and other aspects that's needed. So significant amount of investment needed. So with that, I'll actually conclude my talk and hand it over to the rest of the guys who probably will talk a lot more about the technology.